And then welcome everybody. Good to see you. It's been an interesting year, and then this last week has been especially interesting. When the year started off with January inflation, well, December inflation being fairly tame, and January employment growth being amazing. Then we got, we've now seen January inflation, which was a little higher than everyone liked, and we're getting everybody worried about what the Fed will do. And then we had February job growth last Friday, which indicated much more solid job growth than a lot of people like me expected. And then we've, had a few interesting things that showed up as well. President Biden released his budget last week. Then there was a little bit of activity with some banks. Silicon Valley Bank on Friday had a run. And there was a worry that they would fail. And the regulators worked over the weekend to come up with a plan that appears to have guaranteed money for depositors above the $250,000 amount that the FDIC insured guaranteed, but does not guarantee a return for investors, as I understand the deal, but I haven't read all the fine print yet. I don't think they've released all the fine print yet. And then over the weekend, we had Signature Bank shut down. So the markets were up and down a fair amount today. I think they finished a little bit down, but not terribly. And the headlines indicate that because of the bank issues, we won't call them failures at this point, the inflation fight may be a downgraded emphasis for the Fed. All that being said, if you've got issues you want to talk about, put them in the chat or just talk, and we'll try and cover the presentation that we've got and leave time to go ahead and discuss some of these more recent topics. Somebody's got something in the chat. Not sure what. Okay, never mind. And so anyhow, this is the March meeting of the fiscal group. Basically, it's to give you the facts, allow you to use those facts to sharpen your arguments, communicate to your audience, whoever they may be, whether you've got a Twitter account, a blog, you comment on articles, or just communicate with your friends. Have those fun, heated political discussions. So we're going to talk about the labor market and the budget outlook. And I'm probably going to cover those. And then we're going to have David talk about the economic outlook and inflation and wages based upon pretty much information through last Friday, because life got interesting over the weekend, and then other economic statistics. So let's get started. Somebody else is in the chat. Can't see what. Wouldn't a whole bunch of banks be in the same position, also savings and loans, credit unions, etc.? Possibly. Depends upon how they were what's the right capitalized, I guess. The issue, as I understand it, is something that I first encountered back in '93, when the savings and loans were failing back then, that if a bank or savings and loan invested in some treasuries, and let's say, well, they were higher interest rates back then, well, let's say they bought treasuries that were paying 2%, and we're holding those and planning to hold them to maturity, and then we have rates that have gone up now, and the So similar maturities, are paying 5%, then if you have to sell those bonds now, you're going to get a lot less than what you paid for them. On the other hand, if you hold them to maturity, you don't have to write them down. And so that's the question of, can you hold those assets at the cost, what you paid for them, because you're planning to hold them to maturity, or do you have to mark them to market because you have a run on the bank assets and you need those to pay out? And what we have right now, as I understand the deals that were made over the weekend, is that the Fed has set up loan capabilities that the banks can borrow against the original value of those treasuries to pay a run on the bank assets, and so don't have to sell them at a loss right now.
So that would help, I guess, in a short term kind of thing. But underneath that, I'm sort of wondering more. Banks make their money by borrowing at one rate and loaning at another rate. And if a bank has any kind of assets, and they consider their loans to be assets, they don't have to be treasury bonds. They can be any bond or any loan. When the interest rates go up, the value of those loans is going to go down, even if they're like home loans. We're loaning people money for a house. If the rate goes from, say, 3% to 6%, now the value of that loan has gone down. And it seems like that crunch is independent of whether you bought treasury bonds or any other kind of gave any other kind of loan. And it's not clear to me how you escape that in a rising interest rate situation.
The short word is derivatives. They will hedge that exposure. So if they are seeing exactly what you're saying and they're seeing the value of their assets drop, and everybody knew this, right? I mean, it wasn't like it was a surprise that the Federal Reserve is going to be raising rates over the past year, right? So
They've been announcing it for years.
Exactly.
Well,
so a lot of companies entered into these hedging arrangements so that if the asset price drops, their derivative goes in the opposite direction. Their hedging instrument goes the other way. And so that's why a lot of companies are not going to be in the same situation, but there will be some. I mean, it's definitely a concern out there. And one of the things that the Federal Reserve did over the weekend, or was it today, they announced that they would be, this is a tricky thing to explain and I don't 100% understand it, but it's if the bank pledges its collateral with the Federal Reserve. So if they say, Fed, we'll give you this, we will borrow money from you, the bank wants to borrow money from the Fed, they will pledge one of those bonds that has fallen in value, they will pledge that as collateral, and the Fed will lend to them at the face value of that instrument. So, for example, if the bond was 100 cents on the dollar, and because interest rates went up, now it's at 80 cents on the dollar or 75 cents on the dollar, the Fed will still lend 100 cents to that bank if they pledge that asset that's worth 75 cents now. They can still get the face value. And that is exactly to address the concern that you brought up, Paul, which is this asset price has fallen. And banks, it's not a bad thing if you're a bank to buy a long-term treasury. You shouldn't be punished because you bought a long-term treasury, but if you did, you do have to hedge some of that risk to make sure you've got enough cash for, a small, I want to call it a run, but a relatively small group of people that want to take out their deposits. But no bank, even a healthy bank, can survive a true run. And this bank had a lot of very large depositors that all ran at the same time. And we don't know exactly how all that came down, like exactly who was the first to start alerting all their peers that, hey, something's wrong there, you need to take all your money out. We know that, conservative guy Paul Thiel,
Peter Thiel.
Thiel.
Peter Thiel.
He did that.
He was first.
He was one of the first. I don't know that he was the first. We have a lot of news that he was doing that, but you know, there was a lady interviewed on CNN. She owned a company and had some of her deposits at that bank. She said that she got an alert from one of her investors. She said she referred to it as a cryptic email saying, "Get your money out of this bank," basically. So we'll see if there's any criminal activity here, if anybody was shorting the bank stock and tried to create a run on purpose, or if it was just one of those very unusual events where there was sort of a groupthink and a bunch of people decided to pull their money out of this bank at the same time. But I think, as Mark was alluding to, this guy, Thiel, or is it Thiel? Thiel?
THIEL.
Yeah, I don't know how it's pronounced, but he was early, and it was one of the people telling all his people to get the money out. But I don't know that he was the first. And so we'll see when they investigate this. But the Fed has really done, as you guys were talking about earlier, the Fed has said depositors will be maintained whole, and also they set up this instrument, this facility, I think they call it, so that the banks can borrow at face value, even though that collateral value, that bond asset has fallen, as Paul was talking about. They can still get money at the par value, full value, 100 cents on the dollar from the Fed. And I'll stop there.
It's essentially an insurance policy where the premium is paid after the fact.
Yeah.
There's some moral hazard there.
I'd like to know more about these hedging things, because it seems to me that somebody has to be taking the other side of that bet, and under the conditions that we're seeing, they're going to want a lot to be betting on the other side, if you get what I'm saying. Or am I totally misunderstanding?
Well, I think that a lot of that downside risk is now covered.
Yeah, by the Fed
by the government, right?
Yeah.
Silicon Valley Bank did not hedge the 1.9 billion that they went to write off.
Yeah.
They were one of the few banks that were not hedging for some reason, probably because of availability.
Now, in fairness to them, or it's not to them, but to the people who ran at the bank, I don't know if anybody else has been in this experience, but my wife and I had recently been married and moved to Maryland when Maryland had their savings and loan collapse, if you will, after Ohio did. And when Ohio was happening first, the Maryland state government was telling us everything is wonderful. There's no need to worry. This is all backed by the Maryland Savings and Loan Association and the full faith of the government of the state of Maryland, which, as you know, is right next to Washington, D.C. In fact, Washington, D.C. was taken from the state of Maryland to be our nation's capital. But then literally days later, they're walking that back and saying it's an independent organization, da, 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 da. And we had some friends who were in a bank or a savings and loan that what did fail. We were in one that didn't fail, and we still had difficulties, like we couldn't withdraw enough money to pay our rent out of the account, because that was one of the measures they instituted to stem the withdrawals. And of course, the first thing we and everybody else did was we didn't deposit any more paychecks in the savings and loans, knowing we couldn't get them back out. And so that didn't help. Our friends, anyway, this is, I got to say, over 35 years. We just talked to them a couple of years ago, and they told us that summer they had just finally gotten their money back. Okay. And so we're talking 30 some years later, and the value of the dollars they got back, no interest, the value of the dollars they got back were significantly less than they were when they put them in. And it seemed to me that one of the take-home lessons on that was, if there's a run on the bank, you want to be at the front of the line. That's my free advice to anybody on this call, in fact.
Well, you want to be in an FDIC insured account. And
With
under
less than 250K.
per bank.
Because if it's just run-of-the-mill depositors, they're going to apply the 250K limit. In this case, they blank check the depositors.
Yeah. But hopefully with the steps they took will prevent, people feeling like they need to make a run on the bank, whatever bank it is. And so we won't have a lot of these issues going forward. I got a nice
Carl?
email from my bank today about that they do not expect that they will have any problems as a result of this because of their capitalization and the percent of their accounts that are above 250,000. In any case, let's look at the labor market. Last Friday's employment report. We added 311,000 jobs in February. And January was written down from, I forget what it was, 517 to 504. So there were minor adjustments to January and December, reducing jobs by 34,000, but we still had, a large number of jobs added in February, and we're still showing a really big number in January and a really big number in 2022 with all the adjustments that got made in January. So we have record jobs level. We're about 3 million above the pre-COVID peak for jobs. And so that is all good. Job creation under Biden is averaging almost 500,000 jobs a month. We expect that number to go down. But, we were recovering from the pandemic job losses that were primarily in February, March, and April of 2020. So job growth in the last 3 months has been about 350,000. See the 3-month average. And again, Fed perceives that slowing job creation is a positive to reduce inflation. And the estimate is that we need about 190,000 jobs per month required to keep unemployment rate stable. And actually that's not payroll jobs, but total number of people employed over in the household survey. Unemployment rate crept up slightly from 3.4 to 3.6%. Again, the unemployment rate is the number of people who are not working, but who actively looked for a job in the prior 4 weeks, divided by the total number of people in the labor force, which is the people not working plus the people working. Excuse me while I sneeze. Or hopefully don't, and the U6 rate also went up a little bit to 6.8%, but it includes everybody who has looked for a job, who's not working, but has looked for a job at any time in the last year. And it also includes as unemployed, anybody who has a part-time job, but wants a full-time job. But basically, the fact that those rates went up slightly is mostly a function of a big increase in the labor force, which is a good thing. We had a healthy number of additional people becoming employed, but more than twice that number being added to the labor force. So that should provide, from the Fed standpoint, good news, a little downward pressure on wages. From an individual standpoint, it may not be quite as good a news, but it's saying that there's enough jobs out there and they're paying enough money that people who have not been working and have not been looking for work are coming back into the labor force. I'm scanning the chat right now to see if there's anything I need to deal with. Doesn't look like at the moment, but if anybody feels like they want to discuss anything, feel free to speak up. The employment to population ratio for prime age workers, again, 25 to 54, excludes most students and most retirees. So it tends to be a truer measure of the employment to population ratio. And so what you've got is it's coming back up. It's almost where it was prior to the pandemic, but not quite. We were 80.6% prior to the pandemic, and we're 80.5% last month. So that's a good sign. And with all of that happening, again, we're getting more people back into the labor force. Job openings continue to be strong compared to the unemployment level. And as a reminder, the unemployment level is independent of the number of people collecting unemployment benefits. The unemployment level, I believe, is somewhere around 2 to 3 times the number of people that are collecting benefits. Any questions on the employment reports, labor markets? Let's move on. Okay, the CBO budget outlook, which we'll take at face value, although we'll comment that they did not include anything like the job gains that we've seen in January and February in their forecasts, which would mean that tax revenues should be higher than what they included in their forecast because of additional people working. So the fiscal years run from October 1st to September 30th. The red were Trump fiscal years. The blue, well, this was an Obama fiscal year. These are Biden fiscal years. And these are future president fiscal years. It might be Trump, might be Biden, might be somebody new. Versus what we've seen previously, these numbers are higher than they had been. They were down closer to $1 trillion. And I have not analyzed why they are significantly higher. 2022 was significantly higher because of the student loan forgiveness program, which is proposed. But what that $400 billion difference in 2023 and other years is unclear to me. So this is just looking at what happened in fiscal year 2022, and we've seen this before. We had the deficit in fiscal year 2021. With more people working, we had revenue increase by $850 billion. At a certain level, we had spending decrease by $975 billion, but that was offset by planned future spending of student loan forgiveness of $425 billion. So that netted to $550 billion of a spending decrease. It is unclear what the Supreme Court is going to do with this number. If they totally stop it and say that the program is illegal, there will still be some portion of this number that will be real because of the pause on student loan repayment that's been extended through June, I think, at this point. But anyhow, we've got plans for outlays, plans for revenues. And it's true that on the one hand, revenues had never been higher than, almost 20% in the early 2000s, 20% of GDP. On the other hand, we knew we were going to have spending going up because of all the future retirees as baby boomers retired. And we cut taxes and ignored the fact that the outlays were going to be going up. Revenues by category, individual income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate income taxes, and other. And individual income taxes are projected to fall in 2023 because a lot of people had capital losses in 2022, not capital gains. So capital gains taxes will be lower in 2023 than they were in 2022.
Carl, I have a question on that last slide. So let's assume that over the year, we have 1 million new job created. On a very rough number, what does that mean to payroll taxes, the center line here? What does it mean to individual income taxes? Or what, I mean, is it a small bump or is it a percentage increase?
You know, you're saying an additional million payroll jobs versus what's in the CBO forecast?
Yeah, and I really don't know what's in their forecast, but I know that we've had like, what did you say, almost 820,000 new jobs already in the first 2 months. So just assuming that it slows down and we have bad months and good months, we have 1 million new workers. What kind of impact does that have?
Well, again, the CBO forecasts include a certain number of new workers, new jobs. So, but if we have 1 million more workers than is in the CBO forecast, then employment has gone up by, I don't know if there's 150 million workers and you add 1 million. My math skills are escaping me at the moment, but 0.06% or something like that.
I'm doing that right now. I'm trying to give them a number. There's about 5 trillion in revenue. And if you divide that by 150 million, got my Excel over here, that is 33,000 in revenue on average per person. So if you had 1 million times 33,000,
33
that
billion.
would be what, 33 billion?
Yeah.
$33 billion from another, okay, yeah.
It's
Yeah,
bigger
gotta
than
be more than that.
response, but it doesn't offset the whole thing.
Yeah. Yep. One. So many zeros, I'm trying to get there, but yeah, let's see, times 1 million. Yeah, it's 33 billion, about $33 billion if you had 1 million extra workers in revenue.
Okay,
And
so
that's
an
not just
increase.
payroll tax revenue, that's total. That would be all
Okay,
kinds.
so-
I just divided the total revenues by that. So
Yeah. So an increase, but not a huge bump.
Correct.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
And this just talks about the realized capital gains are a function of, is the market going up or down? Are people selling their equities with gains? Which was big in 2021 and not so much in 2022. Outlays, we have a huge amount of outlays that occurred during the pandemic recession that we're now seeing plan for mandatory outlays going up, Social Security, Medicare. Discretionary spending, the CBO is forecasting to go down. And interest, with interest rates rising, they're expecting it to go up. So there's a couple of reasons why expenses are going up versus historical numbers. One is the baby boomer retirements, and the other is the relatively large amount of national debt and the interest rates. And I saw something flash across my screen earlier today that interest rates may have dropped a little bit as a result of everything that's happened with the bank and the Fed and everything this weekend. I don't know how real that is.
I saw it in the Daily Herald.
But yeah, we'll see what happens as interest rates shake out over the course of the week. Okay, computer, quit spinning and let's
Just
advance.
a comment on this screen here, the GDP is growing at about the nominal GDP, so not adjusted for inflation, but you figure on average, it grows about 2% real, and then you add 2% inflation, you've got nominal GDP around 4% a year. So if something is rising as a percent of GDP, that means it's growing more than 4% a year. And so like Carl was saying, that interest is going way up. Discretionary is falling, meaning they're sort of keeping defense, and some of the other sort of agencies of the government are not seeing big bump ups in a normal year. You know, when this inflation is behind us, you're not seeing big bumps there. So they're growing at less than 4%. And then the mandatory spending, the Social Security and Medicare and others are growing faster than that 4%. So just keep that in the back of your mind. If this line is going up, that means it's growing faster than about 4% a year on average.
Good point. Okay. And this is looking out 30 years in the future, how we expect costs to grow. Looks like, if I'm reading this correctly, we've got a certain amount of the growth is the aging of the population. And then some is additional cost growth. Because we're expecting that medical costs will continue to have inflation above average inflation. Or on Social Security, we're not seeing that. We're just seeing costs going up as a result of the aging of the population. As people like me are going to start collecting Social Security in the next couple of years. And here we've got the budget outlook over the next 10 years as percentage of GDP. And we see that we had tax revenue of 19.6% of GDP in fiscal year 2022, but then it's falling. And then assuming that the Trump tax cuts are allowed to expire, we expect it, tax revenues as a percent of GDP to go up a little bit. Outlays again, mandatory were peaked. We're planning to see those go down a little bit before they come back out at the 10-year time frame as we start seeing Social Security and Medicare and all the retirees. Discretionary goes down, interest costs go up. So why did the CBO increase the sum of the deficits by 3.1 trillion, the 10-year deficits by 3.1 trillion in the February 23 baseline versus prior? A big chunk of it, about half of it, is higher interest rates because the Fed is trying to fight inflation and using higher interest rates as a result. There was additional funding for CHIPS and IRS in some of the bills that were passed. The PACT Act increased some benefits. Aid to Ukraine is small, the higher cost of living adjustments for inflation. But then a couple of things bring down the estimates, the allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices and higher wages and inflation causing tax revenue to go up. And thank you, Bill, for putting the link to the presentation in the chat for anybody that wants to pull it up, save it themselves, and or just take a look at it on their screen so they can go back and forth. Federal debt held by the public currently is a little bit below where we were during World War II, but it's projected to go up substantially in future years if we don't do anything, either cutting spending or raising taxes. And this is just another way to look at the outlays and revenues and stuff for fiscal year 2023, which is the current fiscal year, which ends September 30th. So we're about halfway through the fiscal year currently.
One of the things about this is these, can you show that for a second, Carl? This idea of tax expenditures is all the loopholes that are in there. So these are all the discounts that people have off of just paying the standard income tax rate, table rate. So these are things, some of them are listed over to the right-hand side. So like when the famous one we always talk about are capital gains being taxed at 20% and not at the top marginal rate. That's called a preferential rate. There's an exemption where if you're working for a corporation and they are paying some of your healthcare premiums, that you don't get, that is not charged to you as income. So that's exempt from taxation, an exemption. And things like charitable contributions, there's all kinds of different deductions that people have away from these table rates. But the thing about it that shocks people is how much it is. And it's 7.5% of GDP. And Carl was showing earlier, I think, was it 5.5% of GDP was our deficit?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, and if you take out the student loans, it's like 3.8. So this thing, if you take out student loans, tax expenditures are twice, almost twice the size of the budget deficit. So if you were to just take those away, and they're also very much canted toward the top, meaning that about half the benefit goes to the top 20%. So if you took away the tax expenditures from the top 20%, you would basically cover the budget deficit from this year. And that's not a precise math because people are pretty good at evading taxes once they realize that tax is out there, or they don't get the special treatment. But it's amazing how much this is, and people often don't realize it. You don't even have to technically raise taxes. You could just take away the deductions and exemptions and special treatment, mainly for the top 20%, and almost eliminate the current budget deficit that we have.
Isn't
I just wanted to put that out there.
Isn't Indivisible one of those things that it's deductible to donate to, and as well as the preceding organizations?
I don't believe so.
OFA wasn't tax deductible? I thought it was. I thought it was a 503c4.
I don't know the answer to that question.
C4 is not tax deductible. C3 is.
What's the other ones that's tax deductible?
C3.
There's another one besides C3.
Well, those are the only two I know.
But I mean, you know, those of us that have property taxes and mortgage interest and things like state income taxes that used to be big deductions on your federal income tax, those are all included in the tax expenditures lines here. And then this is the estimate for tax cheating, for lack of a better term, the tax gap, I guess we're calling it. The difference between what people should owe and what they actually pay. Your Cayman Islands account and all those good stuff.
And it's almost, if it's $500 billion, 500 billion, that's half of our deficit.
Correct.
Today. You know, I mean, that's not chump change. That's serious money.
So, but, you know, the Republicans in the House want to cut the additional monies of 80 billion over 10 years, or about 8 billion a year, so we don't try and go after this this underpayment, the tax gap. It's one of their expense cuts that will add to the deficit if it goes through.
So how much of this tax amount that's not being paid would be recovered with the new IRS agents and workers and people that are looking through the filings?
Throw darts to try and guess.
Okay.
Yeah, I think CBO came up with a $200 billion number over a decade. And this number is 500 billion per year. So they're not estimating that the IRS is going to get a whole bunch of this, but 200 billion is better than zero. So the idea being, if we invest 80, we'll get 200 back. That's a two and a half times or whatever our investment. That's a pretty good deal. Unless you're a rich person that's not paying your taxes, in which case this is very scary to have the IRS getting funded to come after it. But it's a much bigger opportunity than CBO. CBO did not score it this way. This is what the IRS is assuming, but CBO is not saying we think we can capture this. It's 200 billion over a decade or so.
So
But again,
what that
it's,
does say, though, is that the question you should be asking your U.S. representative, U.S. senator, is how much of these tax avoidance things did they repeal? That's the only real question that we need to be asking. We have plenty of taxation. We have just too many holes in it. If we take the holes away and collect our taxes, we don't have a revenue problem. The revenue problem is caused by holes, purchased holes and cheats.
well, this is not talking about changes to the tax laws. This is talking about underpayment under then current tax laws.
Yeah, I know, but we're activists, and we have something to say to our representatives.
But I'm just saying it's a different conversation in this chart.
Fair enough.
So we've got, again, the fiscal year 2022 was Biden's first budget year. And we're seeing that the new baseline, the current baseline looks much worse than what it looked like when Biden took office. The deficits are substantially higher. And that's not a good thing, because that's contrary to what we typically have seen with Democratic presidents. And here we're seeing.
I can help here a little bit. I mean, what this does is that number on the prior page, the $2 trillion different. So Biden inherits this trajectory of deficits of 39, almost 4 trillion over 4 years. Then he changes it. He ends up at, right now he's ending up at 6 trillion. And so it got 2 trillion worse. That's a 54% worse. And this is just in his 4 years that he's budgeting. Same analysis for the other presidents, you see much larger percentages. So Bush really got a lot worse. He was expected to have a surplus during his years, and he had ended up with a big deficit, a 7 trillion swing, 190% worse. And so Obama, Trump. Now notice that Trump, though, is only 4 years, and he's still 5 trillion worse. 199%, he's the worst of these presidents from a percentage standpoint, but this dollar amount he accumulated in only those 4 years, not 8. He's way worse than Obama. And if you take out the student loans, what Biden's doing, he really is only at 44% for his 4 years. So it's a lot of math. I did actually a chart that looks like the prior page for each of the presidents, and we'll show that at some point in the future. But each of these numbers is how much worse the deficit trajectory got from the CBO baseline right before they started versus in the case of former presidents where they ended up, and in the case of Biden where CBO thinks he's going to end up based on their latest baseline. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a lot of numbers. Any questions on that? You'll see a lot of people, and I see an enormous amount of this on Twitter and other places of people throwing around, president had so much debt added under their presidency, blah, blah, blah. What really matters is how much worse they made it versus what they inherited. And so that's what that diagram shows with Biden is it shows what he inherited and then where he is now. With the other presidents, when you see those charts some point, maybe at next meeting or a future meeting, you'll see that, those are actual numbers of how they truly did end up.
Okay, and the biggest, notwithstanding all the stuff with the banks going on in the last week, the biggest risk is still the fact that we're going to reach the debt limit sometime, probably this summer, unless we raise the debt limit. And Republicans in the House seem to want to play chicken with it and risk significant damage to the economy. So here's just a little historical context on the fact that Republicans like to play games with the debt limit when we have a Democratic president, and they'll raise it without question when we have a Republican president.
Yep.
And
Shocking.
Democrats really don't want to mess around with the economy regardless of who's president, by and large.